Lower the lights. Put on your headphones. This story begins now. Some stories don't ask whether you believe in God. They ask whether you believe in consequences. This one doesn't begin with a storm. It begins with a choice, made quietly, in a small town, where distance matters and belief is assumed. What followed wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it left behind a question that never quite found an answer. Tonight's story takes place in Texas, in 2007, between a church and a piece of empty land. Listen carefully, because nothing here is as simple as it sounds. There's a certain kind of silence you only notice at night in small towns. Not the peaceful kind people write postcards about, but the attentive kind. The kind that listens back. Mount Vernon was that sort of place. In 2007, it sat quietly in East Texas, tucked between long roads and longer memories. A town where people waved not because they were friendly, but because they recognized you. Where most buildings had already lived at least one full life before you ever noticed them. Where Sunday mornings still arrived early, and faith wasn't something discussed, it was assumed. On one side of a narrow stretch of road stood a Baptist church, red brick, white trim, a modest cross that caught the sun just before dusk. On the other side was an empty plot of land. For years, nothing happened there. Grass grew tall, then short, then tall again. Dogs crossed it. Children cut across it on their way home from school. It was a gap in the town's rhythm, unremarkable, almost invisible, until the sign went up. It appeared quietly, like most important things do. No announcement, no meeting, just a wooden board hammered into the soil one afternoon. Letters painted dark enough to be read from the road. A bar was coming, not a loud one, not a neon-soaked place with thumping music and open doors. Just a simple drinking establishment. Legal, permitted, approved by the necessary authorities. But location has a way of turning ordinary decisions into symbolic ones. The church noticed first. Someone mentioned it after a Wednesday evening service. Not from the pulpit, just a passing comment near the door. Someone else confirmed it. Someone else frowned. Someone else said nothing at all, which in Mount Vernon meant much more than speaking. By the following Sunday, the space between the church and the empty lot felt narrower. The businessman behind the bar wasn't from Mount Vernon originally. He'd arrived years earlier, quietly enough to be accepted. Paid his taxes, kept to himself, didn't make trouble. He saw an opportunity in the town, a place for people to sit, drink, talk, forget. He followed the rules, filed the paperwork, got approval. To him, it was business. To the church, it felt like proximity. At first, they chose the polite route. Letters were written, carefully worded, respectful. They spoke of values, of community standards, of concerns for families and appearances. They were sent to the local municipality, folded neatly, stamped, signed. Replies came back just as neatly. The bar was legal, the permits were valid, there was nothing to be done. That should have been the end of it. But faith doesn't end where bureaucracy begins. The next step was quieter. Every evening, after the sun slipped low and the heat loosened its grip, people gathered inside the church. Not in protest, not in anger. They gathered to pray. No shouting, no signs, no confrontation. Just prayer. They prayed that the bar would not open, that it would fail before it began, that something, anything, would intervene. They prayed for protection, for righteousness, for the soul of their town. They prayed with the calm certainty that prayer, when shared, accumulates weight. Outside, construction continued. Trucks arrived in the mornings. Concrete was poured. Walls went up. The empty lot began to look like something permanent. Each new beam felt like a quiet rebuttal to the prayers happening just across the road. Some nights, as the church lights glowed softly, workers stayed late. Power tools hummed. Metal clanged. Two worlds occupied the same stretch of darkness, separated by little more than asphalt and belief. The prayers continued. Not desperate ones, confident ones. Weeks passed. The bar took shape, roof, windows, signage. It was almost ready. A place that had existed only in plans and arguments now stood fully formed, waiting for its doors to open. Then came the storm. No one remembers exactly when the clouds rolled in. Storms in Texas don't always announce themselves. They gather quietly, stacking the sky until it feels heavy. That night, thunder arrived first. Not the distant kind. The kind that rattles glass and makes you pause mid-thought. Wind followed, then rain, hard, sudden, unforgiving. And then lightning. A single strike cut through the dark and found the bar. It didn't graze it, that didn't miss by feet or inches. It hit directly. By morning, the building was gone. Not damaged, destroyed. Walls collapsed inward. The roof caved. What had been nearly finished was now unrecognizable. Across the road, the church still stood. When word spread, reactions differed depending on where you stood. At the church, there was relief. Some called it gratitude. Others called it confirmation. Quiet smiles replaced worried glances. Someone said aloud what many were already thinking. The Lord has answered our prayers. The sentence didn't echo. It didn't need to. Across the road, the businessman stood where his investment used to be. What he saw wasn't divine, it was financial. Years of planning, money, and patience reduced to debris in a single night. And something else stirred there too. Not grief, not anger, conviction. Because if prayers had been spoken, and they had, then causality, in some form, had been invited into the conversation. Weeks later, Mount Vernon heard something it had never heard before. A lawsuit was filed. Not against the storm, not against fate. Against the church. $2 million. The claim was simple in wording, complicated in implication. That the prayers offered by the church had led, directly or indirectly, to the destruction of the bar, and therefore, to the loss of the investment. Faith had crossed into court. And suddenly, belief was no longer abstract. It was about to be examined under oath. Courtrooms have their own kind of silence. It isn't reverent, it isn't peaceful. It's expectant. Mount Vernon had never hosted anything like this before. Minor disputes, zoning disagreements, the occasional argument over land boundaries. Yes. But a lawsuit pitting a church against a businessman over the power of prayer? That felt larger than the town itself. People filled the benches not because they were curious about legal procedure, but because they wanted to see belief placed under a microscope. The bar owner sat quietly at his table. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look bitter either. If anything, he looked resolved, like someone who had followed a thought all the way to its uncomfortable conclusion and refused to turn back. Across the room, representatives of the church sat together. Familiar faces, neighbors, people who had prayed beside one another for years. Now they shared a different posture, straighter, guarded, cautious. The case began the way all cases do, with words that sounded neutral but carried weight. The plaintiff's argument was simple, at least on the surface. The church had actively opposed the bar. They had prayed specifically for its failure. The building had been destroyed. Whether one believed in divine intervention or not, the intent had been declared aloud, repeatedly, in a collective setting. The result had followed. Directly or indirectly, the loss was real. The defense did not argue emotion. They argued distance. Prayer, they said, was spiritual, not causal. Symbolic, not mechanical. The storm was an act of nature, not an answer. Coincidence was not culpability. At one point, the words reasonable connection were spoken. At another, plausible influence. But everyone in the room knew that wasn't really what the case was about. It was about ownership of belief. When it was the church's turn to speak, something interesting happened. They denied responsibility entirely. Not just legally, but conceptually. They stated clearly and firmly that prayers have no measurable effect on real-world events. That no one could prove a causal link between what happens in a place of worship and what happens under the open sky. To support this, they introduced a study. Harvard University. Dr. Herbert Benson. The study suggested that prayer and religious practice do not influence external outcomes. That while prayer may comfort those who practice it, it does not alter the course of storms, accidents, or material events. The words landed softly, but they landed. Some people in the room shifted in their seats. Because the argument worked. Legally. But spiritually, it felt like something else entirely. The businessman listened closely. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Not because it strengthened his case, but because it revealed something he hadn't fully expected. The people who had prayed so confidently, night after night, were now insisting that prayer carried no real power. Not when it came with consequences. The contradiction wasn't shouted. It wasn't pointed out dramatically. It simply existed, sitting there between the tables like an unanswered question no one wanted to pick up. Witnesses were called. Statements were made. The storm was described in technical terms: weather patterns, lightning probability, structural vulnerability. Science did its best to make the night ordinary. And yet, no one could ignore the timing. The judge listened without interruption. He didn't lean forward, didn't frown, didn't nod. He let the case exhaust itself. By the time closing statements ended, the courtroom felt heavier. Not because of tension, but because of realization. Everyone sensed that no verdict would fully satisfy what had been unearthed. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about what people say they believe, and what they're willing to stand behind when belief stops being comfortable. When the judge finally spoke, his tone wasn't stern. It was puzzled. He admitted something judges rarely do. He said he didn't know what decision to make. Not because the law was unclear, but because the implications were. Then he said the thing no one expected. He didn't side with either argument. Instead, he observed them. He noted that in front of him sat a bar owner who fully believed in the power of prayer, enough to claim it had destroyed his livelihood. And across from him sat a church community that had prayed fervently, yet now denied that prayer had any real power at all. The room didn't react. No gasps, no murmurs. Just stillness. Because the sentence didn't accuse, it revealed. The case ended without a dramatic ruling. No thunderous legal precedent. No victorious speeches. But Mount Vernon changed that day. Not outwardly. The church still stood. The bar was never rebuilt. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. But something subtle had shifted. People spoke differently about prayer after that. More carefully. More selectively. Some prayed less aloud. Some prayed with new hesitation. Some prayed privately, unsure of what they actually expected to happen. And the space between the church and the empty lot, once just a physical distance, had become something else entirely. A reminder. That belief, once spoken, does not disappear when questioned. It waits, quietly. Years passed. Mount Vernon didn't mark the time by anniversaries of the case. No one said, "It's been 10 years since the lightning." That's not how small towns remember. They remember by omission, by what never returned. The lot across from the church stayed empty. Grass reclaimed it slowly, patiently, first in patches, then fully. The ground settled, as if nothing had ever stood there at all. Children stopped cutting across it. Dogs found other paths. Eventually, it became just another quiet piece of land, unremarkable again, but not forgotten. The church continued as it always had. Sunday services, Wednesday evenings, hymns sung by the same voices, just a little older. New families came. Others moved away. The cross still caught the sun before dusk. From the outside, nothing suggested that belief had ever been questioned inside those walls. And yet, something subtle lived beneath the routine. People prayed differently now. Not less, just differently. The prayers were shorter, less specific. Fewer requests for outcomes, more requests for strength. Words like "if it is your will" appeared more often, like a soft disclaimer woven into devotion. No one announced this change. No meeting was held. It emerged the way realizations often do, quietly, without permission. Because once belief is tested publicly, it never returns to its earlier innocence. The businessman left town a year later. No farewell. No bitterness expressed aloud. He sold what he could, absorbed what he couldn't, and moved on. People disagreed about him long after he was gone. Some said he was wrong. Others said he was brave. Most didn't say anything at all. But those who remembered him clearly remembered one thing. He had believed. Not selectively, not conveniently. He had taken the prayers seriously, perhaps more seriously than those who had spoken them. That irony lingered. Sometimes, late at night, the story resurfaced in conversations. Usually after someone asked a question they hadn't meant to ask. Does prayer actually change things? Or does it only change us? And if it changes nothing, why do we guard it so fiercely? No one answered directly. They talked instead about storms, about coincidence, about how lightning has a mind of its own, about how courts are not the place for faith, and faith is not meant to be proven, all of which may have been true. But none of it erased the quiet contradiction that had once stood in open court. A group that prayed for intervention, then denied intervention, existed when it carried a price. It's easy to believe in forces beyond us when they work in our favor. Harder when they demand responsibility. That's the part no one preached about afterward. The judge, for his part, never became famous for the case. It wasn't cited in textbooks. It didn't reshape the law. But those who were present remembered his words precisely because they weren't a ruling. They were a mirror. He didn't say who was right, that he didn't say who was wrong. He simply noticed who believed what, and when. And sometimes, that's more unsettling than judgment, because it leaves the work unfinished. Years later, someone new might pass through Mount Vernon and never know the story. They'd see a church, a patch of land, a quiet road. Nothing more. But for those who were there, the space between the buildings never quite closed. It remained a question made of distance. How much do we truly believe in the things we say? And how quickly do we abandon them when belief stops being symbolic? Late at night, when towns are quiet and thoughts get honest, that question has a way of resurfacing. Not as accusation, as reflection. Because belief isn't proven in moments of comfort. It's revealed when consequences arrive, and we're forced to decide whether to stand by what we once asked for. The grass grows, the church stands, the storm passes. But the question remains. And sometimes, that's the most enduring thing of all. Belief is easy when it stays invisible, when it costs nothing, when it never has to explain itself. But sometimes belief steps into the light, into courts, storms, and consequences. And when that happens, we don't always recognize our own reflection. The church still stands, the land remains empty, and the storm has long passed. But the question lingers, quietly, waiting for the next person who asks for something, and means it. Thank you for listening, and good night.